The road at the bend of Willow Court curls like a comma waiting for trouble to arrive, and I live at the pause. On quiet mornings, the cul-de-sac sounds like a gentle engine of routine as sprinklers tick and sparrows argue over crumbs on the asphalt. That piece is why the thin envelope under my doormat felt like a small siren. A notice, crisp and officious, announced that my 6-foot fence was the center of a height nonconformity review, and that the board would discuss remedies at a special meeting on Friday. The next line dangled a phrase I could not ignore: potential demolition under an accelerated timeline. I stood under the porch light and felt the wattage turn my front step into a stage. The fence runs along my corner lot, built within the same lines the previous owner left me, cleared by a contractor who measured twice and cut once. The view it blocks is little more than a stretch of curb and the neighbor's hedge, but here, appearances are treated like security systems. I read the letter twice, then laid it on the kitchen counter like evidence. The part about a 72-hour notice whispered a countdown that could begin at any time. It was bait. It was pressure. It was the kind of tone that turns living rooms into war rooms. I promised myself one thing as the fridge hummed behind me: if they try to rush a teardown by Monday, I will not be the punchline. Petty justice is a currency in a place like this, and I was ready to spend it carefully, one documented inch at a time. The board might think deadlines beat facts, but I was going to test whether facts, properly arranged, could choke a deadline. Two names define the association here. There is the president, who runs the meetings with a pen that never seems to run out of ink, and there is the treasurer, who treats the rules like recipes that must be followed to the exact teaspoon. Hovering near them at every gathering is a neighbor I'll call Ms. P, who behaves like a roving compliance camera. She is the kind of person who calls a lawn too green and a holiday light too cheerful. When she walks past, phones tilt away and conversations thin, as if even words can be cited. On the bulletin board beside the mail kiosk, the agenda for Friday's special session was already posted, its corners pinned like a butterfly under glass. That sheet would become my first tangible counterweight: a board agenda excerpt listing corner lot fence item 4B, height review and action. I photographed it under the afternoon glare for the timestamp. Our covenants use the calmest words to make the strictest points. In the bylaws, Section 4.3 is written with the kind of precision that suggests endless debate in its past. I knew it from a neighbor's earlier skirmish over a trash enclosure, height, sightlines, corner visibility triangles, and a single line about exceptions for corner lot fences adjacent to collector streets and busier bends. That line was the hinge, and I felt it give a little when I pushed. The fence along my lot sits against a bend that attracts delivery vans and morning commuters cutting the corner too tight. If the exception was crafted for safety and visual uniformity on these curves, then the board would have to explain why my fence wasn't covered. I started a ledger that night. On the first page, I wrote 3 headings: Final notice dated May 12th, CCR Section 4.3 corner lot exception, and board agenda excerpt for May 16th. These were my props, my anchors, the objects that turn anecdote into something you can hold. I was not going to allow a whisper campaign to outrun paper. By dawn the next day, I walked the perimeter with a tape measure, remeasuring every panel to the quarter-inch while the air carried a faint cut-grass smell from a yard up the street. The fence stood even and exact, 6 feet where privacy mattered, stepping down near the sidewalk where views mattered more. A prior survey, rolled in a cardboard tube the seller left me, showed the same line, the same setbacks, the same corners. I laid the survey flat on the table and weighed its edges with coffee mugs until the paper stopped curling. The dates sang harmony: the survey's month, the receipt from the contractor, the city's permit number. If this was going to be a HOA revenge story, it would be one built from calm documentation, not loud speeches. The conflicts didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived with a neighbor's slow stroll and a polite nod that carried judgment like perfume. I did not respond. Narration works better when the narrator doesn't argue with every passerby. I kept taking photographs of sightlines from the sidewalk corners, framing the angles the bylaws described. The visibility triangle at the bend, 15 feet by 15 feet, was clean. My fence retreated from it like a well-trained dog, exactly where the survey said it should. I marked each image with the date and time, Because when the committee starts speaking in broad strokes, a timestamp becomes a scalpel. Around noon, I reviewed the association minutes from the last quarter. The treasurer's notes hinted at a quiet frustration about visual clutter on corner lots. It read like a prelude to a campaign. That was fine. If they wanted to reach for broad aesthetic strokes, I would hold them to the narrow text. I printed CCR Section 4.3 and highlighted the corner lot exception in yellow, then printed Section 4.3(c) again and marked it with a different color for the clause about necessary adjustments for safety, erosion control, and municipal compliance. The bend on Willow Court is not a highway, but it behaves like one after-school drop-off, and I had phone videos from 2 separate weeks showing near misses at the curb. The fence isn't a hazard, the curve is. Late afternoon brought a second envelope, slid under my door with a subtle tap. This one wore a bolder tone. It warned that, should Friday's vote determine non-compliance, the association could issue an accelerated remediation, including removal within 72 hours. It did not say demolition, but it traced the outline. The letter was formatted like every notice the manager has ever sent. The only flourish was the way the words 72 hours sat alone on a line, as if the font knew it was supposed to be loud. I locked both letters in a plastic sleeve and clipped them into a binder behind the final notice dated May 12th from a previous matter that was resolved in my favor. That old notice was not just nostalgia. It proved the association knew my address and my lot specs when it chose to escalate then stand down. It is easier to argue that someone is out of step when you can show their earlier dance. The meeting notice included a list of supporting materials available upon request, so I sent a one-line email requesting everything related to item 4B. I did not plead or posture. I kept the tone flat, like a file drawer opening. An hour later, the manager replied with attachments. A set of photos taken from the far side of Willow Court at sundown, when shadows made every vertical line look taller, a staff memo questioning the fence height on the corner taper, and a cursory measurement sketch that did not match the survey. I printed the memo and tacked a small sticky flag where it cited a community standard of 5 feet near sidewalks. That phrase does not exist in CCR Section 4.3. It's the kind of line that grows in the garden of convenience. As the sun slid behind the roofs, I took one more lap around my lot, listening to the modest chuff of an irrigation line 2 houses away. I tried to see the fence the way the board might describe it, imposing, uneven, maybe even showy. It still looked like a straight-backed line of cedar doing a simple job. If this was what the association wanted to turn into a spectacle, I was willing to meet them on stage with receipts and maps. The first act of a Karen neighbor drama ends best when the audience wants to see a plan, and I had one. I set my timeline. Thursday morning would be for gathering signatures from the immediate neighbors who share the bend. I wasn't collecting a petition to wave around. I wanted specific statements about sightlines at the corner, about delivery vans, about school mornings when the curve turns into a brief parade. I drafted a short, neutral form with checkboxes and a space for comments. I included a map of the corner visibility triangle and the relevant sentence from CCR Section 4.3, bolded but not dramatic. Facts could do the heavy lifting if I let them. For the board's benefit, I assembled a clean packet. The survey map with the fence line traced in bright pencil, my afternoon photos labeled with compass directions, a printout of the board's own agenda excerpt with item 4B circled, and a one-page note explaining how the corner lot exception applies to my lot, written like a calm explainer rather than a complaint. On the last page, I placed a copy of the final notice dated May 12th from a previous case and wrote a single sentence at the bottom. Prior communications about this lot confirm location and setbacks. I wanted them to feel the weight of continuity, not confrontation. By evening, the wind picked up and made the fence whisper like a metronome, steady and unafraid. I stood at the curb where the bend begins and watched headlights smear across the asphalt. This was the angle the bylaws meant when they wrote about triangles and visibility. I didn't need to say it out loud. The road said it for me with every passing car. The plan for Friday was simple: attend, present, and refuse to let urgency become an argument. The plan for Monday, should they dare to start a 72-hour clock, was simpler still: Use their timing against them with a request for a municipal safety review that would pause any demolition until a city inspector weighed in. Deadlines lose their bite when a bigger calendar steps into the room. If the board pushes an accelerated notice at the vote, the clock will start ticking toward Monday, but I am ready to make that countdown work for me instead. I did one last check of the binder before bed. Every page had a tab. Every tab had a label: Survey, Photos, CCR Section 4.3, Agenda, Prior Notice, Neighbor Input. The binder felt heavier than paper. It felt like ballast. When I turned off the lamp, the room dimmed to the soft pulse of a digital clock on the stove, and I found a strange comfort in the numbers. Time would be loud tomorrow. My job would be to make facts louder. Morning arrived with a thin layer of dew on the grass and a postman's cart squeaking faintly down the block. I started with the house across the bend, where sight lines matter most. I did not ask anyone to take a side. I asked them to look from their driveway toward the corner and tell me whether the fence blocked their view of cars entering the curve. Where they saw clean angles, they ticked a box. Where they saw concerns unrelated to the fence, like a tree at the curb or a parked SUV, they wrote a note. I numbered each statement and mapped it to a parcel ID. I was building a mosaic the board could not dismiss as a rant. At midday, I measured distances again, this time forming a triangle on the curb with painter's tape to match the code definition. It looked almost theatrical on the concrete, like stage markings for a scene not yet performed. I photographed it from shoulder height and knee height, because the board's photos love dramatic angles. I wanted the honesty of the everyday view. The staff memo gnawed at me. It referred to community standard, as if aesthetics carried the force of law. I pulled the last 2 years of minutes and highlighted every time community standard appears. The pattern was obvious. The phrase shows up when the board leans on preference rather than text. I added a short paragraph to my note. Community standard is not a term in CCR Section 4.3. Technical compliance requires reference to measurable provisions. It read like a gentle correction, not a rebuke. That tone matters when the audience thinks it is the judge. I also called the city's planning desk, not to trigger a process, but to confirm how one is triggered. Without relaying names or addresses, I asked what happens when a corner lot fence gets challenged for visibility. The clerk pointed me to a general policy. If a safety review is requested, it pauses enforcement actions pending inspection. I recorded that process and printed the policy page from my binder. I would not threaten the board with it. I would simply place it in front of them if they mistook speed for authority. By late afternoon, my packet felt complete. The only thing missing was the emotional shape of Friday, and I couldn't plan that. I could only plan the record. I walked the bend one more time and thought about how these stories travel online, how they turn from small-town pettiness into parables. I did not want to be a caricature of a homeowner yelling about freedom. I wanted to be a careful narrator in a homeowners association drama where petty rules meet their match in measured resistance. The difference is not the volume, it is the evidence. I went to bed early with the packet on the kitchen table and the binder's spine aligned with the table's edge. The house settled around me with the small clicks and sighs that old wood makes after sundown. The fence outside faced the curve with the same posture it had yesterday and would keep tomorrow. I found comfort in its steadiness. Friday would try to bend it. My job was to show that the rules, properly read, already account for this bend. The morning of the meeting arrived with a sky the color of fresh paper, and I took it as a good omen. I wore something plain and carried nothing but the binder and the packet. I did not plan to fill the room with talk. I planned to let the documents do the work. The clubhouse, where the board meets, has a polished floor that makes every footstep sound like a mild announcement, and the air always smells faintly of copier toner. I signed in and took a seat near the aisle, close enough to hear the pens scratching at the table. Before the president called the session to order, I placed a copy of my packet on the staff table and another on the corner of the dais where the treasurer sits. The treasurer glanced at the tabs, then at me, then at the clock. That was all I needed. A reminder that time is not a weapon if someone else can slow it down with a single question about a highlighted clause. The packet contained those questions, waiting to be asked. The president began with routine items that slid past like low waves. Then came item 4B, the fence at the corner. The manager summarized the memo. The treasurer mentioned standardizing sightlines. Ms. P adjusted her chair like a spectator adjusting binoculars. When the president opened the floor, I stood, not to perform, but to place the record. I described my lot using the survey, then walked them through CCR Section 4.3 and its corner lot exception, and then showed the visibility triangle I taped on the curb. I kept sentences short and anchored in the documents. I referenced the final notice dated May 12 from an earlier matter to show the association's familiarity with my lot. I ended with the neighbor statements mapped to parcels. It was difficult for anyone to roll a complaint across that many measured inches. The room did what rooms do when there is more paper than opinion. It got quiet. The president asked the manager whether the memo's community standard had a definition in CCR Section 4.3. The manager looked at the paper. The treasurer asked whether the corner lot exception could apply to reduce conflict by aligning safety intent with existing structures. The paper answered that too. The only thing the paper could not answer was speed. The president, perhaps sensing that the thread of urgency was fraying, suggested a quick site visit after the meeting. I had anticipated that. I had a spare packet for anyone who needed a map of the triangle. As the board filed out for the site visit, I stayed behind for a moment and looked at the agenda pinned on the bulletin board outside the room. A fluorescent light flickered overhead, giving the paper a faint pulse. Item 4B had been a hammer in the invitations. It was becoming a ruler in the room. I followed the group outside, binder tucked at my side. At the curb, the bend showed its nature. A delivery van turned in too tight and climbed the gutter with a soft thump, then corrected. The president watched, hands behind back. The treasurer traced the triangle on the ground with eyes narrowed, comparing curb, sidewalk edge, and fence line. Ms. P stood farther back, like a person waiting for a magic trick to fail. I did not speak. The evidence had a voice of its own here. The treasurer checked a phone level against the fence, then stepped back into the triangle. The president conferred with the manager for a moment, and I caught only one word through the breeze: exception. Back inside, the president announced that the board would deliberate in the final portion of the meeting. I took my seat, binder quietly shutting like a book at the end of a polite chapter. The clock's minute hand moved in clean clicks, and the room returned to procedural items about landscaping bids and pool hours. These are the soft cotton of association meetings, and they can lull anyone into thinking nothing sharp is coming. I stayed alert. This was the space where a vote could either validate the exception or reach for the pressure of a 72-hour countdown. When the president returned to item 4B for deliberation, the conversation took on a constrained tone. There was acknowledgement of the corner lot exception. There was mention of aesthetic uniformity in transition zones. There was a proposal to require a minor taper adjustment at the sidewalk end while preserving the 6-foot line along the bend. Then, like a late arrival, the suggestion emerged: issue a conditional notice that, if the adjustment is not made by Monday, enforcement begins. I recognized the shape immediately. This was that 72-hour motif wearing a new hat. I did not interrupt. I did not frown. I simply wrote one line in the margin of my packet: conditional deadline invites municipal review. I was ready for the chorus I knew might come next, the one where urgency poses as fairness. If they wanted to sing it, I would answer with a newer, larger calendar. The president called for a motion. The treasurer hesitated, then asked whether enforcement would pause if a safety review was requested. The manager said that historically the association cooperates with city reviews. The treasurer looked at the clock, then at the packet on the dais with the policy page tucked inside. The motion, when it finally arrived, included a carve-out, a short compliance timeline for a minor taper near the sidewalk, paired with a pause provision if a city safety review was requested. It was not victory. It was something sturdier, a rule recognizing another rule. The vote was scheduled for the end of the session. I could sense the room's appetite for quick closure. I could also feel the line in the notice that would follow if the motion passed without the pause language. That was the line I had already prepared for. When they reached item 4B again, the president read the motion with the pause provision intact. It passed, 2 hands brisk, 1 slower hand after a glance at the packet. Ms. P's face tried to be unreadable and didn't quite make it. The meeting adjourned with a gentle tap of the gavel. Outside, the late-day light washed the clubhouse wall in a warm band, and a lawnmower started in the distance like a polite engine clearing its throat. The manager told me a conditional notice would be prepared and delivered by evening, including the minor taper request and the Monday timeline. I nodded once. The binder felt lighter now, as if the paper inside had turned from defense to direction. Back home, I opened to the tab labeled Municipal Policy and placed it on top. I printed a short request for a safety review regarding sightlines at the bend of Willow Court, referencing the exact code triangle and including my survey and photos. I stamped the request with the date and kept it beside the door. If the notice arrived with a clock inside it, I would answer with a calendar outside it. They planned to wind a 72-hour spring that would snap shut by Monday. I planned to click open a process that would hold that spring in midair. I stood on the porch at dusk and watched the streetlights flicker on in a staggered pattern, one by one, like a countdown starting far away and moving closer. The air smelled faintly of warm cedar as the fence held its line along the bend. The day had traded me a threat for a process, and a process is easier to carry through a weekend than a threat is. Tomorrow I would tape a single sheet to the inside of my front window, the clause from CCR Section 4.3 that keeps corners honest. It wouldn't be a dare. It would be a reminder. I still had the neighbor statements, each with parcel IDs and checkboxes. I copied them into a one-page summary by address and trend. No reported sightline obstruction from the bend at driveway level. Frequent notes about vans clipping the gutter when they swing in too tight. One mention of a parked SUV blocking views at school hours. Trends matter to boards that say they care about standardization, because trends look like standards if you squint. I slid a copy of the summary under the manager's door with the addendum so it joined the official record. Monday's 5 p.m. deadline still sat on the notice like a coiled spring, but the safety review receipt jammed a small, deliberate wedge into its gears. If they tried to wind the clock, the wedge would hold. Saturday morning wore a clear sky and a faint scent of cut cedar that lingered near the taper. I took a final measurement and filmed the view from 3 heights: eye level, mid-torso, and the height of a small child, because board arguments sometimes borrow the vantage of hypotheticals. The video moved slow and steady, like a documentary pan, and I saved each clip with file names that began with dates. The binder had grown into a toolkit. In the evidence log, I numbered each item and wrote a one-line purpose in the margin: show triangle, show taper, show unbroken curb line, show delivery van approach. I was disciplined because discipline is the only antidote to vague standards. By noon, the cul-de-sac had the small soundscape of a neighborhood at rest. A dog tag chiming against a water bowl, a mower somewhere beyond the bend, the soft knock of a mailbox closing. I worked on one last piece, a pair of small reflective markers placed on the curb at the triangle's points. They were temporary and removable, purely visual aids for the inspector and anyone else who cared to look downstream from the rule. They caught the afternoon sun like tiny coins and made the angles unmistakable. The manager emailed a short acknowledgement that the addendum, photos, and safety review receipt were added to the file for item 4B. That file had become not just a record but a future script. If the board wanted speed, the file made them slow down to turn pages. If they wanted a uniform conclusion, the file forced them to read the uniform text they signed when they bought homes like mine. Ms. P circled the bend twice during the afternoon, pausing near the sidewalk to take photos that were more dramatic than accurate. She favored the angles where the lens stares up from knee level, a place where any fence looks imposing against a sky that is always ready to be a backdrop. I did not interfere. Optics are a temporary sport. Documents remain when the sunset filters are gone. Sunday brought a quiet more fragile than the day before, as if the street had learned about Monday's clock and wanted to hush while it waited. I reviewed the conditional compliance notice, May 16th again, and noticed a phrase that matched the board's tone but not their text. Accelerated remediation may include structural removal. The pause clause stood 2 lines below it, calm in its promise to respect a municipal safety review. The 2 sentences sat like neighbors who do not get along. I printed a copy with both lines highlighted in different colors and appended a margin note. Enforcement paused upon safety review receipt. The note wasn't for the board. It was for me, a reminder to hold my line if someone decided to forget a clause at the door. The board's next move would cost them social capital if they overreached. A Monday push against a documented pause would look less like compliance and more like theater, and the audience here loves seeing theater fail. Midday, I saw a utility golf cart at the far end of the street carrying two people in polo shirts with association logos. They were doing weekend rounds, clipboard balanced on a lap, eyes trained on driveways. They stopped at my curb, looked at the taper, then at the reflective markers, and wrote something. I did not need to know what the note said. The presence of the clipboard was enough to keep my posture even. If their notes tried to stage a Monday rush, my receipt would stand up and ask a larger calendar to speak. I spent the last hours of Sunday staging the binder like an exhibit. Tabs visible, key items at the front, duplicates in a separate thin folder to hand over without breaking my own set. I placed a small sticky on CCR section 4.3c with 3 words: intent, safety, uniformity. If anyone tried to pretend the rule had a purely aesthetic aim, I would let the ink say otherwise. Evening arrived with a ceiling of soft clouds that turned the streetlights into halos. I stood at the curb and watched a minivan ease into the bend, brake lights glowing briefly as the driver eyed the triangle. The fence didn't intrude, and the triangle didn't lie. The air smelled faintly of wet concrete as the sprinklers began their timed murmurs along the block. The clock that mattered was not the one in the notice. It was the one that turned on water at the same moment every night, indifferent to board moods. Monday morning began with the simplest act. I printed a cover letter that listed the items in my addendum file and referenced the safety review receipt number at the top in bold. I delivered it to the manager with a quiet nod and returned home to wait for the inspector's scheduling email. The notice's 5 p.m. deadline hung like a sign I had already replaced with a different sign. Even so, I took nothing for granted. I set an alarm for 2 p.m. to walk the bend with a fresh set of photos in the exact afternoon light the board favors. If they were going to make a last-minute scene, the scene would have my lighting, not theirs. At 11:20 a.m., a short email landed from the city. Inspection scheduled for Friday morning at 9:30 a.m. The association was included in the thread. The tone was dry and procedural, a relief after a weekend of theatrical phrases. I printed the email and taped it to the inside of the binder's cover. The pause had a date now. The wedge in the gears had grown into a small steel bar. The afternoon stirred at the cul-de-sac's edge. A landscaping truck rattled past and parked 3 doors down, its idle clucking like a watch too large for a wrist. I walked the triangle and checked the reflective markers, still aligned with the chalk I laid on Friday. The taper's plane remained perfect when I set the digital level on the top rail. The display hummed a quiet number and held steady. My photos at 2 p.m. matched the weekend's frame lines with mathematical ease. I took comfort in repetition. It's how you prove something is true in more than one light. At 3:15 p.m., the manager sent a mass email to the board and to me confirming receipt of the city's inspection date and noting that enforcement of item 4B would be paused pending the result. The email did not apologize for the earlier clock, it simply corrected it. I printed that note too and slid it behind a tab labeled Manager Acknowledgement, Pause. I enjoyed giving the page its own title. Documents like titles. By late afternoon, the board's attempt to press a 72-hour timeline had met 3 quiet facts: the corner lot exception in CCR section 4.3, a precise taper completed and logged, and a stamped safety review that forced a pause. My binder carried each item like a rung on a ladder, and every step I climbed was made of paper, not noise. The pause did not make Ms. P less curious. She returned at 4:30 p.m., phone in portrait mode, then landscape, then tilted for drama. She lingered at the sidewalk corner where the taper began and captured the panel from below, then from the cross street where the fence looks longest against the sky. I let the camera work. The photo that matters rarely comes from a knee. I walked the inside of the fence line and checked for splinters where we had planed the top rail. The wood felt smooth and sure beneath my fingertips. The fence had become more than a boundary. It was a measure of how a rule becomes real. With a pause established, I shifted from defensive calibration to strategic preparation. Retaliation here would not be revenge disguised as compliance. It would be compliance used as a mirror. If the board wanted to emphasize uniformity, I would show them where their own decisions departed from their stated standards. I opened a fresh tab labeled Comparative Compliance Log and began cataloging 3 nearby corner lots whose fences either exceed 5 feet near sidewalks or intrude into the visibility triangle by inches. I did not plan to shame neighbors. I planned to present anonymized, parcel-only comparisons that ask the board to explain itself. Uniformity is loud until statistics enter the room. I pulled 2 years of architectural review approvals from the association portal and highlighted every instance where the committee granted variances for corner lot structures. Trash enclosures, hedges, planter walls, each came with notes about existing streetscape harmony and case-by-case discretion. The phrases looked like daylight. Discretion cuts both ways. Once you prove it exists, you can ask why it spared some corners but not yours. I added a concise, neutral chart to my addendum: date, parcel, variance type, reason given, and sightline notes if present. I labeled it Variance Map, Corners Only, and printed it in grayscale with clean grid lines that make people stop to read. The sky shifted toward evening as I bound the new pages. I placed the chart behind the pause acknowledgement so the narrative would move in a single, firm direction. Text, demonstration, pause, comparison. I built a 1-paragraph cover note. Intent is to align corner lot decisions with the safety-focused language of CCR Section 4.3 by documenting variances granted to similar parcels. I did not accuse anyone of favoritism. I invited them to admire their own discretion on paper. Tuesday dawned with a thin marine layer that softened the street's edges. I used that light to photograph the comparison corners at the same time, standing at the same distances, marking the same triangle points on the curb with removable tape. My intention was not spectacle, it was symmetry. I compiled the images into a 3-column sheet with parcel IDs stripped and replaced by letters. The effect was clean and plain. Any person could see how a 5-foot section near a sidewalk lives in quiet peace on one lot while the same line provokes sermons on another. By mid-morning, I drafted a short memorandum for the board's Friday packet titled Corner Lot Consistency and the Intent of Section 4.3. It contained 4 points: the text of the exception and its safety aim, the documented completion of the taper, the scheduled city inspection, and the comparison chart demonstrating variance patterns. I requested that Item 4B be reopened at the next regular meeting to align any remaining conditions with the standard applied to similar corners. I submitted the memo to the manager with a request that it be included in the distribution. My tone never rose above steady. Retaliation works better with a level voice. The inspector's Friday appointment waited on the calendar like a hinge that would close the first chapter of this fight. Between Tuesday and Friday, I polished my materials and prepared one more element: a practical demonstration to accompany the inspection. I borrowed 2 foldable cones from a friend and placed them at the triangle's curb points during the hour before the inspector's arrival, then removed them afterward. The cones were not theatrics, they were a way to make geometry visible to tired eyes. I logged the times and took a single photo, then put the cones away, because even helpful props can irritate a process if they linger. When the city inspector steps into the triangle on Friday, the association won't just face a measurement. It will face a mirror, and the reflection may demand a policy rewrite that outlasts any fence. I stopped at the curb and listened to the neighborhood breathe. The marine layer lifted and the sky sharpened to the kind of blue that makes painter's tape look extra honest. I peeled up the temporary triangle markers and folded the tape onto itself like a completed ritual. The bend smelled faintly of warm asphalt. My plan had set the board's clock aside. Now I would set its compass. Friday arrived with a pale sky and a thin breeze that made the reflective curb markers wink like tiny signals. I set the binder on the console table near the door and waited for the knock that would change the tone from rumor to record. At 9:28 a.m., the city inspector's sedan rolled to a calm stop at the bend. The inspector stepped out with a clipboard and a tablet, took in the curve, the sidewalk, and the taper, and then walked the triangle as if reading the street like a diagram come to life. I stood back, hands quiet, voice quieter. When the inspector measured the triangle and sightline in 3 passes, each result matched my photos and the survey. The tablet stylus tapped through a checklist that looked like an outline I could have written myself. Triangle clear, corner taper adequate, fence height compliant on bend, visibility at driveway approach unobstructed. The inspector added one note I appreciated more than any number. Corner behaves like a collector curve at school hours. Current configuration supports safety aim of code. When item 4B opened, the manager summarized the inspection. Triangle clear, taper adequate, no obstruction. The treasurer added a sentence about safety intent and municipal alignment. The president spoke of aesthetics and transition zones and suggested that a uniform taper near sidewalks could help corners look cleaner across the neighborhood. The words sounded like a last thin argument leaning against a closed door. I placed my consistency request, corner lots on the staff table, and waited. The floor opened briefly for homeowner comment. I did not tell a story. I presented a matrix. I set down the 3 comparison photos labeled A, B, and C and explained the sightline checklist and the simple guideline for staff photos. Shoulder height only, never from knee level, never from the far cross street where foreshortening lies. I asked the board to adopt the checklist, to codify the photo standard, and to close item 4B by rescinding the conditional notice for my lot and any similar lots that passed the new matrix. I never raised my voice. The paper raised it for me. Ms. P sat in the second row, phone dark, posture attentive in a way that suggested disappointment searching for a place to land. The president glanced at the treasurer, then at the inspector's findings, then at the comparison matrix. The room's sound changed, a subtle shift from brittle to deliberate, as the board realized that a policy could be born here, not a spectacle. If the board codifies the matrix, their attempt to rush a teardown becomes the reason a new rule protects every corner. Quiet revenge wrapped in policy. The treasurer moved first, a motion to adopt a corner lot sightline checklist modeled on the city's triangle, to require shoulder height photographs for documentation, and to rescind any pending enforcement under item 4B where the checklist is satisfied. The president added a friendly amendment. Install a uniform, measured taper standard when adjacent to sidewalks, with a grace window for existing fences to adapt. The manager nodded as if she had already made a folder for this policy in her mind. The vote was not theatrical. It was steady. All hands rose. Item 4B was closed with 3 sentences that mattered. City standard adopted, taper standard clarified, enforcement rescinded where the checklist is met. The gavel did not sound like victory. It sounded like alignment. The room released a breath I didn't realize it was holding. After the vote, the president asked the manager to prepare a short bulletin for the community summarizing the new corner lot policy. The treasurer added a request that staff retrain on photo documentation to avoid perspective bias. The manager took notes with the efficient loops of someone relieved to trade drama for procedure. I did not leave. Retaliation still had one more step, one I had prepared with the same calm as the rest. The comparative compliance log and variance map. Corners only were not just exhibits, they were invitations. During the open forum, I placed a copy of each on the dais and suggested a quarterly review of corner lot decisions against the matrix, with anonymized results published as a small chart in the newsletter. The point was not to shame, the point was to make discretion visible enough to stay honest. The president agreed to add quarterly corner review to the governance calendar. The treasurer suggested that the first review include the 3 anonymized parcels A, B, and C I had presented. The manager wrote that down too. Ms. P approached the staff table after adjournment, glanced at the matrix, then at the inspector's finding, then at the taper photo. Her eyes lingered on the guideline that forbids knee-height photos. She did not object. She did not speak. She simply left with the rest, the kind of exit that reminds everyone that theater without an audience becomes rehearsal. The cul-de-sac that evening felt different. The wind carried a clean, cool edge that made the cedar boards smell like the inside of a pencil box. The triangle at the curb looked almost ceremonial with nothing to prove and everything to show. I filed the last page behind a tab labeled Resolution. Policy adopted and closed the binder. Its weight changed again. It no longer needed to be ballast. It could be an archive. Aftermath arrives on small feet. Over the next week, a short bulletin appeared on the association's portal, Corner lot policy update with a checklist graphic and 3 bullet points. The board rescinded enforcement notices where the checklist applied, scheduled tapers where needed, and explained that staff photos must be taken at shoulder height to avoid perspective distortion. The bulletin did not mention my lot. It did not need to. Every corner knew. The treasurer sent a brief email to owners along the curve reminding them that the matrix is about safety before aesthetics and that discretion remains, but must be paired with measurements. That pairing is the real revenge. A petty push turned into a measured practice that will outlast anyone's mood. I walked the bend at dusk and watched a child's scooter flash past the triangle line while a sedan took the curve calmly. The fence kept its posture, the taper held its plane, and the street felt newly legible. Financially, the only cost on my side was the contractor's hour to complete the taper and verify the plane. The association, however, had to publish a correction, adjust training, and schedule a quarterly review, time and attention that might have chased someone else's project if item 4B had sailed through on a 72-hour clock. This is how petty power loses ground, not with noise, but with the slow inconvenience of being precise. I kept my binder near the front closet even after the policy settled. Not because I expected another fight tomorrow, but because a neighborhood like this treats memory as a hobby. Documents become the stories we agree to tell ourselves when the next agenda goes up. Tell me your HOA fence fight horror in one line. The week after the policy change, a new notice bloomed on the bulletin board beside the mail kiosk, the paper still warm from a printer that never seems to sleep. It wasn't about fences. It was about the street itself. A proposal, drafted by a committee with a name that sounded like a quiet warning, suggested a parking alignment pilot, on weekends, no curbside parking from Friday night to Sunday evening on the cul-de-sac's outer ring, to preserve views and reduce clutter. The rationale read like déjà vu for anyone who has ever watched an aesthetic argument dress up as safety. I passed by at twilight and watched 3 cars loop the bend twice, looking for a space that wouldn't exist under the pilot, while a pair of teens dragged a goal net toward the open asphalt, their laughter skipping across the street like stones on a pond. The same triangle that had measured sightlines last week would measure fairness now. The memo hinted at towing, at patrols, at a new set of tickets printed with tiny boxes waiting for checks. And the name at the bottom? The chair of the committee was a familiar one, a person who had never met a weekend without a clipboard. I slid my finger along the paper, tracing a timeline I knew too well, and felt the story for next time.